What happens if you buy a business and it fails? Do you still need to pay the seller? And might you have any claims against the seller? I'm Malcolm Zoppi, an English qualified solicitor, and in this video, we'll discuss what happens if you buy a business and it fails. Second, what happens to your obligations under the SPA to the seller, the share purchase agreement, and might you have any claims against the seller? And lastly, how to avoid buying a business which then fails. Fantastic, let's get started. So chapter 1 is what are the consequences of buying a business that then fails? Firstly, if you signed any personal guarantees, for example, when applying for financing to buy that business, it's very possible that the lender will call in for all the money to be payable back to them because of that trigger event of the business failing. And if that's not possible, then they will enforce the personal guarantee that they have against you. It might also affect your credit score, for example. Secondly, your actions as a director of the business which then failed might be scrutinized, especially when trying to assess whether you complied with your director's duties. For example, whether you complied with your obligation to not conduct any wrongful trading. Wrongful trading, in short, is when the director of a company continues to trade the business as usual, for example, by incurring liabilities, taking out loans, for example, despite knowing that the business is insolvent. Instead, what they should be doing is stop trading, stop taking on liabilities, and liquidate, so sell off assets and pay the creditors. And thirdly, the third main consequence of the business failing, of course, will be insolvency proceedings. So typically, if a business fails, it's because it's got creditors that it cannot pay. And if that's the case, likely the creditors will bring a claim against the company. And part of that might entail the company going into insolvency and therefore stop trading, assets are sold off, and the proceeds are used to pay creditors as they rank. Fantastic. Let's move on to chapter 2, which is what happens to your payment obligations towards the seller and what claims when you have against the seller. Likely, as part of the deal, you will have deferred a part of the purchase price to be paid after completion to the seller, usually referred to as seller finance. Let's assume that that is the case, and let's assume also that the moment the business fails, there's still money owing to the seller. Do you still need to pay the seller that money that is owed? In short, typically yes. Despite the fact that the business failed, typically the share purchase agreement would not expressly state that the buyer's payment obligations are conditional on the target business continuing to be a profitable business. That typically isn't part of the SPA, and any seller is very unlikely to accept such a provision to be included in the SPA for obvious reasons. They will not have any control over the profitability of the business once they sold it to you. Accordingly, your payment obligations towards the seller for that asset that you bought, despite the asset, the business, having failed, those payment obligations typically would remain. On the other hand, to try and minimize the amount of money that you need to continue paying the seller, you might want to explore any claims that you might have against the seller, therefore set off the amount that you're claiming against the seller from the amount that you owe to the seller. The most obvious type of claim that you would be exploring as a buyer of a failing business is whether any of the warranties that are written into the share purchase agreement have been breached, so that any warranties turn out to be untrue. For example, let's say that the business failed because of huge debts owed to HMRC, but the seller promised that there were no money, there were no debts to HMRC, everything was paid up and on time. If that was the case, and for example, those debts contributed to the business going insolvent, then you might very well have a claim against the seller. That's why I like to include set-off rights in the SPA for my buyer clients. Because if there are indeed any claims for breaches of warranties to be made against the seller, I would much rather my client to be able to set off those claims from any money that they owe to the seller, as opposed to continue paying the seller and then trying to chase their money back from the seller for that separate claim. Now, before we discuss how to avoid buying a business which then fails, feel free to email me if looking for professional legal advice. With my legal advice calls, there are no charges, no obligations, and no nonsense. Contact me now at info@zoppi.co.uk. Fantastic. So chapter 3 is how to avoid this scenario from occurring. How do you avoid buying a business which then fails? Well, the very first thing that must be done is conduct thorough due diligence. So you should appoint professionals such as solicitors and accountants to conduct due diligence on the target business to identify any key red flags that should stop you from proceeding with the deal. The second main thing you'll want to do is include extensive warranties, typically done by your solicitor, in the share purchase agreement. This is so that you are getting effectively the seller to make a lot of promises to you regarding the state of the business. And these, of course, will be positive promises that are good for you to have. And if any of them turn out to be untrue, then you might have a claim against the seller and therefore are able to reduce the purchase price. And lastly, you'll want to defer as much of the purchase price as possible and therefore pay on completion as little as possible. So it puts less capital at risk, and if indeed there are any claims to be made against the seller because of, for example, a breach of warranty, then there is enough money owing to the seller for you to set off any claims that you might have, for example, again, under those breach of warranty. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. I will make sure to answer any questions that you may have. And if you want to learn more about warranties in mergers and acquisitions, make sure to watch this video right here. Thank you for watching.